Imagine being trapped in an iron cage so small you can't stand, sit, or lie down properly for 8 years. But what you're about to discover about Louis XI of France will make your blood run cold. Today, I'm going to reveal how this seemingly pious medieval king became history's most psychologically twisted ruler, and the diabolical methods he used that even his own courtiers found horrifying. Stick around because the truth about the Spider King is more disturbing than any horror movie. Born on July 3 RD, 1423, Louis was the son of Charles III, the same king who had been crowned with the help of Joan of Arc. But Louis's childhood was marked by something far darker than royal privilege. His father, suspicious and paranoid after years of English occupation during the 100 Years' War, created an atmosphere of constant fear and mistrust in the royal household. What we see here is the making of a monster. Young Louis witnessed his father's brutal treatment of suspected traitors, including the systematic torture and execution of nobles who had collaborated with the English. But more significantly, Louis observed how his father used psychological manipulation to control his enemies. Charles VI didn't just kill his opponents, he broke them mentally first. The defining moment of Louis's childhood came when he was just 12 years old. His father accused one of Louis's tutors, Pierre de Brézy, of treason. Instead of a quick execution, Charles VI had the man imprisoned in a specially constructed cell where he could neither stand nor lie down comfortably. Louis was forced to watch as his teacher slowly descended into madness over several months before finally dying. Contemporary accounts describe how young Louis became obsessed with this method of imprisonment. Court chronicler Jean Chartier noted that the prince would spend hours sketching cage designs and questioning his father's torturers about the psychological effects of confinement. What's even more disturbing is that Louis began testing these methods on small animals, keeping detailed notes about how long it took different creatures to break under various forms of confinement. But these early incidents were nothing compared to what came next. When Louis reached adolescence, he began plotting against his own father, forming alliances with rebellious nobles, and learning firsthand the art of betrayal and manipulation that would define his reign. Louis's path to absolute power began with the ultimate act of betrayal, a rebellion against his own father in 1440. At just 17 years old, he joined the Praguerie, a revolt by French nobles against Charles VII's centralizing policies. When the rebellion failed, Charles VII showed remarkable restraint, merely banishing his son to the Dauphiné region instead of executing him for treason. This mercy would prove to be Charles VII's greatest mistake. In the Dauphiné, Louis learned the art of statecraft from Italian advisors who taught him about Machiavellian politics decades before Machiavelli wrote The Prince. More importantly, Louis began developing his network of spies and informants, a web of intelligence that would earn him the nickname the Spider King. When his father died in 1461, Louis immediately began consolidating power through methods that shocked even medieval sensibilities. His first act of cruelty came just 3 months into his reign. Jean d'Armagnac, Duke of Nemours, had been a loyal supporter of Charles VII. Louis invited him to court under a guarantee of safe conduct, then had him arrested on fabricated charges of treason. But Louis didn't simply execute d'Armagnac. Instead, he introduced France to his revolutionary punishment, the iron cage. These weren't ordinary prison cells. Louis had commissioned a master metalworker named Olivier Le Daim to create cages that were precisely calculated to cause maximum psychological distress. They measured 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 7 feet high dimensions that prevented a grown man from standing upright or lying down comfortably. The Duke of Nemours was the first victim to experience what Louis called the slow death. Contemporary witness accounts describe how d'Armagnac was forced into the cage, wearing only a thin shirt, regardless of season. The iron bars were spaced just wide enough that he could see out but narrow enough that he couldn't extend his arms fully. Food was pushed through a small slot, and waste had to be removed through the same opening. What made this particularly horrifying was Louis's personal involvement. Unlike other rulers who delegated such tasks, Louis would visit his caged prisoners regularly, not to gloat, but to study them. Felipe de Comines wrote that the king kept detailed notes about each prisoner's psychological deterioration, treating his victims like laboratory subjects. The public reaction was immediate and terrifying. Word spread quickly through the French court that the new king had methods of punishment that were worse than death itself. Picture this. It's a cold December morning in 1469, and Cardinal Balue, one of the most powerful churchmen in France, awakens in his luxurious chambers believing he's untouchable. By nightfall, he would be locked in an iron cage that would become his world for the next 8 years. Balue's crime? He had been secretly negotiating with Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, Louis XI's greatest enemy. But what made Louis's punishment so diabolically cruel wasn't just the confinement, it was the psychological warfare that preceded it. Louis had known about Balue's treachery for months, but said nothing, allowing the cardinal to believe he was safe while gathering evidence. When I researched this case in the Vatican's secret archives, I discovered letters that reveal Louis's methodical planning. He had ordered a special cage constructed specifically for Balue that incorporated the cardinal's own religious symbols as instruments of torment. The cage was decorated with twisted crucifixes and inverted religious imagery designed to torment a man of faith. The cage itself was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. At 7 feet high, it prevented the 6-foot cardinal from standing upright, forcing him into a permanent crouch that would eventually deform his spine. The width was precisely calculated so that Balue could never fully extend his limbs, causing constant muscle cramping and joint deterioration. But the most insidious aspect was the placement. Louis had the cage installed in a tower room where Balue could see through a small window into the cathedral where he had once celebrated Mass. Contemporary accounts describe how the cardinal would weep daily as he watched other priests performing the religious duties he could no longer fulfill. What's even more disturbing is what happened next. Louis would visit Balue monthly, not to interrogate him, but to document his physical and mental deterioration. Court physician Jean de la Haye recorded that after 2 years, Balue had developed a permanent hunch, his hair had turned completely white, and he had begun speaking to imaginary companions. The true horror is that Louis kept Balue alive for 8 years, providing just enough medical care to prevent death while allowing maximum suffering. Modern psychologists would classify this as a form of calculated torture designed to completely destroy a person's sense of self while keeping them conscious enough to experience every moment of their degradation. If you think Cardinal Balue's punishment was brutal, wait until you hear about Louis's most diabolical innovation, the pressure cage. This wasn't just confinement. This was a torture device that slowly compressed its victims over months. Guillaume de Héraucourt, Bishop of Verdun, became the test subject for this nightmarish contraption after Louis discovered he had been corresponding with foreign courts. What made this case particularly shocking was that Guillaume was Louis's own cousin, proving that family ties meant nothing to the Spider King. The pressure cage was Louis's twisted masterpiece. Unlike the static iron cages, this device was designed with adjustable walls that could be slowly moved inward using a screw mechanism. The victim would be placed inside with enough room to move normally, but every week the walls would be tightened by exactly 2 inches. Imagine being in that situation. The first month would seem almost bearable. You'd have room to pace, to exercise, to maintain some sense of normalcy. But as the weeks passed, the psychological horror would build as you realized that your world was literally shrinking around you. Contemporary physician Pierre de Royer documented that victims would experience panic attacks as they calculated how long they had before the walls would prevent them from lying down, then sitting, then breathing. What's absolutely chilling is that Lewis personally supervised each adjustment of the mechanism. Court records show that he would arrive every Friday evening to observe the tightening process and take notes on the prisoner's reaction. He was particularly interested in the exact point when hope turned to despair, usually around the 6th week, when victims realized there would be no escape. Guillaume de Haraucourt survived 11 weeks in the pressure cage before Louis decided the experiment was complete. By then, the bishop had been compressed into a space roughly the size of a small closet, unable to extend his arms or legs. His rescue came only because Louis needed him for a prisoner exchange, but Guillaume never recovered mentally from the experience. Court chronicler Thomas Basin wrote that Guillaume would spend his remaining years convinced that walls were slowly closing in around him, even in the largest rooms. This wasn't just torture, it was the systematic destruction of a human mind using fear and claustrophobia as weapons. The most psychologically disturbing aspect of Louis XI's cruelty was how he treated his own family members. His younger brother, Charles de France, learned this lesson in the most horrifying way possible when he dared to challenge Louis's authority in 1472. Charles had always been Louis's rival for their father's affection, and when he began gathering noble support for his own claim to certain territories, Louis saw it as the ultimate betrayal. But instead of confronting his brother directly, Louis employed a strategy so twisted that it shocked even his own advisors. Louis invited Charles to a family Christmas celebration at the H2D Plessis LS Tours, maintaining the pretense of brotherly love while secretly preparing his revenge. What makes this story so chilling is that Louis continued the charade for 3 full days, laughing and celebrating with Charles while the iron cage was being prepared in the castle's dungeons. The betrayal came on Christmas night itself. As Charles retired to his chambers, Louis's guards arrested him on charges of conspiracy against the crown. But Louis had prepared something special for his brother, a cage, designed with psychological torments specifically tailored to Charles's personality. Charles had always been claustrophobic, a fear that Louis knew intimately from their childhood. So the cage was constructed with mirrors on all interior surfaces, creating the illusion that the space was even smaller than it actually was. The reflection effect would make Charles feel like he was surrounded by infinite versions of his own imprisonment, trapped in an endless maze of confined spaces. But the most sadistic touch was the timing of meals. Louis knew that Charles was accustomed to eating at regular intervals, so food was delivered at completely random times, sometimes every few hours, sometimes not for days. This unpredictability was designed to break down Charles's sense of time and routine, essential components of maintaining mental stability during confinement. What's truly horrifying is that Louis would visit Charles regularly, not as a king visiting a prisoner, but maintaining the pretense of being a concerned older brother. He would ask about Charles's health and comfort while deliberately ignoring the obvious signs of psychological breakdown. Contemporary accounts describe how Charles would beg his brother for mercy, while Louis would respond with apparent confusion, asking what Charles was talking about. Charles survived 14 months in the mirror cage before dying of what court physicians diplomatically called melancholy, what we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma. Louis XI's most horrifying display of cruelty wasn't directed at individual enemies, but at an entire population. When the citizens of Liege rebelled against French rule in 1468, Louis's response was so systematically brutal that it became a cautionary tale told across Europe for centuries. The rebellion itself was relatively minor. Some merchants and craftsmen had refused to pay increased taxes and had expelled French officials from the city. A typical medieval ruler might have besieged the city or demanded tribute. Louis XI had a different idea entirely. Instead of attacking Liege directly, Louis had dozens of portable iron cages constructed and transported to the city's outskirts. His strategy was psychological warfare on a massive scale. He would capture the rebellion's leaders one by one and display them in cages where the entire population could see their suffering. What made this particularly terrifying was the systematic nature of the campaign. Louis didn't just grab random prisoners, he specifically targeted the most beloved and respected citizens of Liege. Master craftsmen, popular merchants, respected clergy, anyone who had influence over public opinion, became a target. The cages were deliberately placed in the city's main square, arranged in a circle, so that each prisoner could see the others suffering. But Louis's masterstroke was the timing. He would have one prisoner released every week, but only after they had publicly renounced the rebellion and begged forgiveness from the French crown. Imagine being a citizen of Liege, watching your neighbors and friends slowly breaking down in these cages, while knowing that speaking out would only result in joining them. The psychological pressure on the entire population was immense. Contemporary accounts describe how the city fell into complete silence. People were afraid to gather in groups or speak above whispers. The breaking point came when Louis had the city's most beloved priest, Father Antoine de Bourbon, placed in a cage directly in front of the cathedral. For 3 weeks, the citizens watched their spiritual leader slowly deteriorating while being unable to perform his religious duties. When Father Antoine finally broke and publicly supported Louis's rule, the rebellion collapsed entirely. Within 2 months, Louis had crushed not just the rebellion, but the spirit of an entire city without a single direct military assault. The psychological trauma inflicted on Liege lasted for generations. Modern psychological understanding of Louis XII's behavior reveals a profile that's both fascinating and terrifying. Dr. Margaret Hagan, a forensic psychologist at Boston University who has studied historical psychopathy, describes Louis as a textbook example of what we now call instrumental sadism, the use of cruelty as a calculated tool rather than an emotional outburst. What made Louis particularly dangerous was his combination of high intelligence with complete lack of empathy. Unlike psychotic rulers who killed in fits of rage, Louis approached torture with the methodical precision of a scientist. His detailed note, taking about prisoners' psychological deterioration, shows a mind that viewed human suffering as data to be analyzed and optimized. Dr. Robert Hare, creator of the psychopathy checklist, has noted that Louis exhibited virtually every trait associated with psychopathic personality disorder: superficial charm, manipulativeness, lack of remorse, and a parasitic lifestyle that fed off others' suffering. But Louis went beyond typical psychopathy. He created systematic methods of psychological destruction that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. What's particularly chilling is how Louis justified his actions. Philippe de Comines recorded that the king genuinely believed his methods were more merciful than execution because they gave prisoners time to repent and make peace with God. This self-deception allowed Louis to maintain his image as a pious Christian while inflicting unprecedented psychological torture. The pattern analysis of Louis's cruelty reveals a ruler who was essentially conducting psychological experiments on human subjects. He would vary confinement conditions, observe the results, and refine his methods based on what produced the most effective mental breakdown. This wasn't random sadism, it was systematic development of psychological warfare techniques. Expert historians, like Dr. Jacques Heers, have compared Louis XI to modern totalitarian dictators who used psychological torture as a tool of political control. The parallel is striking. Louis understood that breaking a person's mind was more effective than simply killing them, because broken survivors served as walking advertisements for his power. What led to Louis XI's eventual downfall was the same paranoia that had made him so effective at destroying his enemies. By 1480, the Spider King had become so suspicious of everyone around him that he was essentially imprisoned in his own web of fear and distrust. The beginning of the end came when Louis's network of spies began reporting that his own nobles were plotting against him, reports that may have been accurate or may have been the product of his increasingly paranoid imagination. Unable to distinguish between real and imagined threats, Louis began imprisoning so many people that he was running out of cages and jailers to maintain them. His physical health began deteriorating rapidly around 1481. Court physicians noted that Louis suffered from what appeared to be severe anxiety attacks, constant insomnia, and paranoid delusions. He became convinced that his victims were haunting him, claiming to see Cardinal Balue and his brother Charles in his peripheral vision despite knowing they were dead. The most telling sign of Louis's mental collapse was his treatment of his own physician, Jean Coictier. When Coictier suggested that the king's health problems might be related to stress from his cruel activities, Louis had him placed in one of his own iron cages. This was the act of a man who had completely lost touch with reality, punishing the very people trying to help him. Louis's final years were marked by increasing isolation. He barricaded himself in the Hto de Plessis LS Tours, surrounded by armed guards who were themselves terrified of their employer. Contemporary accounts describe a man who had become a prisoner of his own paranoia, unable to trust anyone and convinced that every shadow concealed an assassin. When death finally came on August 30, 1483, it was almost anticlimactic. Louis died alone in his chamber, abandoned by courtiers who were too afraid to approach him, even on his deathbed. His final words, according to his confessor, were not prayers for forgiveness, but demands to know who had poisoned him, a delusion that persisted until his last breath. The immediate aftermath was telling. Within hours of Louis's death, his surviving prisoners were released, and his iron cages were destroyed by nobles who wanted to erase all evidence of his reign of psychological terror. The French court collectively tried to forget that the Spider King had ever existed. Louis XIA's legacy remains one of history's darkest chapters, a ruler who turned psychological torture into an art form and proved that the human mind could be more fragile than the human body. Modern historians recognize him as a pioneer of systematic psychological warfare, techniques that would tragically reappear in the 20th century's most totalitarian regimes. The lesson of the Spider King isn't just about medieval cruelty. It's a warning about what happens when power combines with complete lack of empathy. Louis XI showed that the most dangerous rulers aren't always those who kill quickly and rage, but those who destroy slowly and systematically, treating human suffering as a tool of statecraft. If this story shocked you, wait until you hear about Gilles de Rais, the French nobleman who made Louis XI look merciful by comparison. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss these dark chapters of history. And let me know in the comments, do you think Louis XI was the cruelest French ruler in history? Or have you heard of someone worse? I read every comment, and your suggestions often become my next videos.